as we all wish to say, "Do you know who I am?" You'll want to remind them of what they've forgotten. Your ego screams for you to indulge it. Instead, you must do nothing. Take it. Eat it until you're sick. Endure it. Quietly brush it off and work harder. Play the game. Ignore the noise. For the love of God, do not let it distract you. Restraint is a difficult skill, but a critical one. You will often be tempted. You will probably even be overcome. No one is perfect with it, but try we must. It is a timeless fact of life that the up-and-coming must endure the abuses of the entrenched. Robinson was 28 when he started playing with the Dodgers, and he'd already paid plenty of dues in life as both a black man and a soldier. Still, he was forced to do it again. It's a sad fact of life that new talents are regularly missed, and even when recognized, often unappreciated. The reasons always vary, but it's part of the journey. But you're not able to change the system until after you've made it. In the meantime, you have to find some way to make it suit your purposes, even if those purposes are just extra time to develop properly, to learn from others on their dime, to build your base and establish yourself. As Robinson succeeded, after he proved himself as the Rookie of the Year and as an MVP, and as his spot on the Dodgers was certain, he began to more clearly assert himself and his boundaries as a player and as a man. Having carved out his space, he felt that he could argue with umpires. He could throw a shoulder if he needed to make a player back off or to send a message. No matter how confident or famous Robinson became, he never spit on fans. He never did anything that undermined his legacy. A class act from opening day until the end, Jackie Robinson was not without passion. He had a temper and frustrations like all of us do. But he learned early that the tightrope he walked would tolerate only restraint and had no forgiveness for ego. Honestly, not many paths do. Get out of your own head. A person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts, so he loses touch with reality and lives in a world of illusions. Alan Watts. It is Holden Caulfield, the self-absorbed boy walking the streets of Manhattan, struggling to adjust to the world. It is a young Arturo Bandini in Los Angeles, alienating every person he meets as he tries to become a famous writer. It is the blue blood Binks Bowling in 1950s uptown New Orleans, trying to escape the everydayness of life. These fictional characters all had something in common. They couldn't get out of their own heads. In J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, Holden can't stay in school, is petrified of growing up, and wants desperately to get away from it all. In John Fonte's Ask the Dust, part of a series known as the Bandini Quartet, this young writer doesn't experience the life he is living. He sees it all across a page in a typewriter, wondering if nearly every second of his life is a poem, a play, a story, a news article with him as its main character. In Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, his protagonist, Binks, is addicted to watching movies, preferring an idealized version of life on the screen to his own uncomfortable ennui. It's always dangerous to psychoanalyze a writer based on his work, but these are famously autobiographical novels. When we look at the writers' lives, the facts are clear. J.D. Salinger really did suffer from a sort of self-obsession and immaturity that made the world too much for him to bear, driving him from human contact and paralyzing his genius. John Fonte struggled to reconcile his enormous ego and insecurity with relative obscurity for most of his career, eventually abandoning his novels for the golf course and Hollywood bars. Only near death, blind with diabetes, was he finally able to get serious again. The Moviegoer, Walker Percy's first book, came only after he'd conquered his almost teenage indolence and existential crisis, which lasted alarmingly into his 40s. How much better could these writers have been had they managed to get through these troubles earlier? How much easier would their lives have been? It's an urgent question they pushed onto their readers with their cautionary characters. Because sadly, this trait, the inability to get out of one's head, is not restricted to fiction. 2,400 years ago, Plato spoke of the type of people who are guilty of feasting on their own thoughts. It was apparently common enough even then to find people who, instead of finding out how something they desire might actually come about, they pass that over so as to avoid tiring deliberations about what's possible. They assume that what they desire is available and proceed to arrange the rest, taking pleasure in thinking through everything they'll do when they have what they want, thereby making their lazy souls even lazier. Real people preferring to live in passionate fiction than in actual reality. The Civil War general George McClellan is the perfect example of this archetype. He was chosen to command the Union forces because he checked all of the boxes of what a great general should be. West Point grad, proven in battle, a student of history, of regal bearing, loved by his men. Why did he turn out to be quite possibly the worst Union general, even in a crowded field of incompetent and self-absorbed leaders? Because he could never get out of his own head. He was in love with his vision of himself as the head of a grand army. He could prepare an army for battle like a professional. But when it came to lead one into battle, when rubber needed to meet the road, troubles arose. He became laughably convinced that the enemy was growing larger and larger. It wasn't. At one point, he actually had a 3 times advantage. But he was convinced of constant threats and intrigues from his political allies. There weren't any. He was convinced that the only way to win the war was with the perfect plan and a single decisive campaign. He was wrong. He was so convinced of all of it that he froze and basically did nothing for months at a time. McClellan was constantly thinking about himself and how wonderful he was doing, congratulating himself for victories not yet won, and more often for horrible defeats he had saved the cause from. When anyone, including his superiors, questioned this comforting fiction, he reacted like a petulant, delusional, vainglorious, and selfish ass. By itself, that's insufferable, but it meant another thing. His personality made it almost impossible to do what he needed to do most: win battles. A historian who fought under McClellan at Antietam later summed it up. His egotism is simply colossal. There is no other word for it. We tend to think that ego equals confidence, which is what we need to be in charge. In fact, it can have the opposite effect. In McClellan's case, it deprived him of the ability to lead. It robbed him of the ability to think that he even needed to act. And repeated opportunities he missed would have been laughable were it not for the thousands and thousands of lives they cost. The situation was made worse by the fact that 2 pious, quiet Southerners, Lee and Stonewall Jackson, with a penchant for taking the initiative, were able to embarrass him with inferior numbers and inferior resources, which is what happens when leaders get stuck in their own head. It can happen to us too. The novelist Anne Lamott describes that ego story well. If you're not careful, she warns young writers, station KFKD, K-fucked, will play in your head 24 hours a day, non-stop, in stereo. As she put it, out of the right speaker in your inner ear will come an endless stream of self-aggrandizement, the recitation of one's specialness, of how much more open and gifted and brilliant and knowing and misunderstood and humble one is. Out of the left speaker will be the rap songs of self-loathing, the lists of all the things one doesn't do well, of all the mistakes one has made today and over an entire lifetime, the doubt, the assertion that everything one touches turns to shit, that one doesn't do relationships well, that one is in every way a fraud, incapable of selfless love, that one had no talent or insight, and on and on and on. Anyone, particularly the ambitious, can fall prey to this narration, good and bad. It is natural for any young, ambitious person, or simply someone whose ambition is young, to get excited and swept up by their thoughts and feelings, especially in a world that tells us to keep and promote a personal brand. We're required to tell stories in order to sell our work and our talents, and after enough time, we forget where the line is that separates our fictions from reality. Ultimately, this disability will paralyze us, or it will become a wall between us and the information we need to do our jobs, which is largely why McClellan continually fell for flawed intelligence reports he ought to have known were wrong. The idea that his task was relatively straightforward, that he just needed to get started, was almost too easy and too obvious to someone who had thought so much about it all. He's not that different from the rest of us. We are all full of anxieties, doubts, impotence, pain, and sometimes a little tinge of crazy. We're like teenagers in this regard. As the psychologist David Elkind has famously researched, adolescence is marked by a phenomenon known as the imaginary audience. Consider a 13-year-old so embarrassed that he misses a week of class, positive that the entire school is thinking and murmuring about some tiny incident that in truth hardly anyone noticed. Or a teenage girl who spends 3 hours in front of the mirror each morning as if she's about to go on stage. They do this because they are convinced that their every move is being watched with rapt attention by the rest of the world. Even as adults, we're susceptible to this fantasy during a harmless walk down the street. We plug in some headphones and all of a sudden there's a soundtrack. We flip up our jacket collar and consider briefly how cool we must look. We replay that successful meeting that we're heading toward in our head. The crowds part as we pass. We're fearless warriors on our way to the top. It's the opening credits montage. It's a scene in a novel. It feels good, so much better than those feelings of doubt and fear and normalness. And so we stay stuck inside our own heads instead of participating in the world around us. That's ego, baby. What successful people do is curb such flights of fancy. They ignore the temptations that might make them feel important or skew their perspective. General George C. Marshall, essentially the opposite of McClellan, even though they briefly held the same position a few generations apart, refused to keep a diary during World War II, despite the requests of historians and friends. He worried that it would turn his quiet, reflective time into a sort of performance and self-deception, that he might second-guess difficult decisions out of concern for his reputation and future readers, and warp his thinking based on how they would look. All of us are susceptible to these obsessions of the mind, whether we run a technology startup or we are working our way up the ranks of the corporate hierarchy or have fallen madly in love. The more creative we are, the easier it is to lose the thread that guides us. Our imagination, in many senses an asset, is dangerous when it runs wild. We have to rein our perceptions in. Otherwise, lost in the excitement, how can we accurately predict the future or interpret events? How can we stay hungry and aware? How can we appreciate the present moment? How can we be creative within the realm of practicality? Living clearly and presently takes courage. Don't live in the haze of the abstract. Live with the tangible and real. Even if, especially if, it's uncomfortable. Be part of what's going on around you. Feast on it. Adjust for it. There's no one to perform for. There's just work to be done and lessons to be learned in all that is around us. The danger of early pride. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. C.S. Lewis. At 18, a rather triumphant Benjamin Franklin returned to visit Boston, the city he'd run away from 7 months before. Full of pride and self-satisfaction, he had a new suit, a watch, and a pocket full of coins that he spread out and showed to everyone he ran into, including his older brother, whom he particularly hoped to impress. All posturing by a boy who was not much more than an employee in a print shop in Philadelphia. In meeting with Cotton Mather, one of the town's most respected figures and a former adversary, Franklin quickly illustrated just how ridiculously inflated his young ego had become. Chatting with Mather as they walked down a hallway, Mather suddenly admonished him, "Stoop, stoop." Too caught up in his performance, Franklin walked right into a low ceiling beam. Mather's response was perfect. "Let this be a caution to you not always to hold your head so high," he said wryly. "Stoop, young man, stoop, as you go through this world, and you will miss many hard thumps." Christians believe that pride is a sin because it is a lie. It convinces people that they are better than they are, that they are better than God made them. Pride leads to arrogance and then away from humility and connection with their fellow man. You don't have to be Christian to see the wisdom in this. You need only to care about your career to understand that pride, even in real accomplishments, is a distraction and a deluder. Whom the gods wish to destroy, Cyril Connolly famously said, they first call promising. 2,500 years before that, the poet Theognis wrote his friend, the first thing, Kurnos, which gods bestow on one they would annihilate, is pride. Yet we pick up this mantle on purpose. Pride blunts the very instrument we need to own in order to succeed. Our mind. Our ability to learn, to adapt, to be flexible, to build relationships, all of this is dulled by pride. Most dangerously, this tends to happen either early in life or in the process, when we're flushed with beginner's conceit. Only later do you realize that a bump on the head was the least of what was risked. Pride takes a minor accomplishment and makes it feel like a major one. It smiles at our cleverness and genius, as though what we've exhibited was merely a hint of what ought to come. From the start, it drives a wedge between the possessor and reality, subtly and not so subtly changing her perceptions of what something is and what something isn't. It is these strong opinions, only loosely secured by fact or accomplishment, that send us careening towards delusion or worse. Pride and ego say, I am an entrepreneur because I struck out on my own. I am going to win because I'm currently in the lead. I am a writer because I published something. I am rich because I made some money. I am special because I was chosen. I am important because I think I should be. At one time or another, we all indulge this sort of gratifying label making. Yet every culture seems to produce words of caution against it. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. Don't cook the sauce before catching the fish. The way to cook a rabbit is to first catch a rabbit. Game slaughtered by words cannot be skinned. Punching above your weight is how you get injured. Pride goeth before the fall. Let's call that attitude what it is, fraud. If you're doing the work and putting in the time, you won't need to cheat. You won't need to overcompensate. Pride is a masterful encroacher. John D. Rockefeller, as a young man, practiced a nightly conversation with himself. Because you have got to start, he'd say aloud or write in his diary. You think you are quite a merchant. Look out or you will lose your head. Go steady. Early in his career, he'd had some success. He'd gotten a good job. He was saving money. He had a few investments. Considering his father had been a drunken swindler, this was no small feat. Rockefeller was on the right track. Understandably, a sort of self-satisfaction with his accomplishments and trajectory he was heading in began to seep in. In a moment of frustration, he once shouted at a bank officer who refused to lend him money. Someday, he said, I'll be the richest man in the world. Let's count Rockefeller as maybe the only man in the world to say that and then go on to become the richest man in the world. But for every one of him, there are a dozen more delusional assholes who said the exact same thing and genuinely believed it, and then came nowhere close, in part because their pride worked against them and made other people hate them too. All of this was why Rockefeller knew he needed to rein himself in and to privately manage his ego. Night after night, he asked himself, are you going to be a fool? Are you going to let this money puff you up, however small it was? Keep your eyes open, he admonished himself. Don't lose your balance. As he later reflected, I had a horror of the danger of arrogance. What a pitiful thing it is when a man lets a little temporary success spoil him, warp his judgment, and he forgets what he is. It creates a sort of myopic, onanistic obsession that warps perspective, reality, truth, and the world around us. The childlike little prince in Saint-Exupéry's famous story makes the same observation, lamenting that vain men never hear anything but praise. That's exactly why we can't afford to have it as our translator. Receiving feedback, maintaining hunger, and charting a proper course in life. Pride dulls these senses. Or in other cases, it tunes up other negative parts of ourselves, sensitivity, a persecution complex, the ability to make everything about us. As the famous conqueror and warrior Genghis Khan groomed his sons and generals to succeed him later in life, he repeatedly warned them, if you can't swallow your pride, you can't lead. He told them that pride would be harder to subdue than a wild lion. He liked the analogy of a mountain. He would say even the tallest mountains have animals that, when they stand on it, are higher than the mountain. We tend to be on guard against negativity, against the people who are discouraging us from pursuing our callings or doubting the visions we have for ourselves. This is certainly an obstacle to beware of, though dealing with it is rather simple. What we cultivate less is how to protect ourselves against the validation and gratification that will quickly come our way if we show promise. What we don't protect ourselves against are people and things that make us feel good, or rather, too good. We must prepare for pride and kill it early, or it will kill what we aspire to. We must be on guard against that wild self-confidence and self-obsession. As Flannery O'Connor once said, the first product of self-knowledge is humility. This is how we fight the ego, by really knowing ourselves. The question to ask when you feel pride is this: what am I missing right now that a more humble person might see? What am I avoiding or running from with my bluster, franticness, or embellishments? It is far better to ask and answer these questions now, with the stakes still low, than it will be later. It's worth saying, just because you are quiet doesn't mean that you are without pride. Privately thinking that you are better than others is still pride, and it's still dangerous. That on which you so pride yourself will be your ruin, Montaigne had inscribed on the beam of his ceiling. It's a quote from the playwright Menander, and it ends with, "You who think yourself to be someone." We are still striving, and it is the strivers who should be our peers, not the proud and accomplished. Without this understanding, pride takes our self-conception and puts it at odds with the reality of our station, which is that we still have so far to go, and that there is still so much to be done. After hitting his head and hearing from Mather, Franklin spent a lifetime battling against his pride, because he wanted to do much and understood that pride would make it harder. Which is why, despite what would be dizzying accomplishments in any era, wealth, fame, power, Franklin never had to experience most of what he called misfortunes brought upon by people by carrying their heads too high. At the end, it isn't about deferring your pride because you don't deserve it yet. It isn't, don't boast about what hasn't happened yet. It's more directly, don't boast. There's nothing in it for you. Work, work, work. The best plan is only good intentions unless it degenerates into work. Peter Drucker. The painter Edward Degas, though best known for his beautiful impressionistic paintings of dancers, toyed briefly with poetry. As a brilliant and creative mind, the potential for great poems was all there. He could see beauty, he could find inspiration. Yet there are no great Degas poems. There is one famous conversation that might explain why. The poet Stéphane Mallarmé, about his trouble writing. "I can't manage to say what I want, and yet I'm full of ideas," he said. Mallarmé's response cuts to the bone. "It's not with ideas, my dear Degas, that one makes verse. It's with words, or rather, with work." The distinction between a professional and a dilettante occurs right there. When you accept that having an idea is not enough, that you must work until you are able to recreate your experience effectively in words on the page. As the philosopher and writer Paul Valery explained in 1938, a poet's function is not to experience the poetic state. That is a private affair. His function is to create it in others. That is, his job is to produce work. To be both a craftsman and an artist. To cultivate a product of labor and industry instead of just a product of the mind. It is here where abstraction meets the road and the real, where we trade thinking and talking for working. You can't build a reputation on what you're going to do, was how Henry Ford put it. The sculptor Nina Holton hit the same note in a landmark study on creativity. That germ of an idea, she said, does not make a sculpture which stands up. It just sits there. So the next stage, of course, is the hard work. The investor and serial entrepreneur Ben Horowitz put it more bluntly. He said, the hard thing isn't setting a big, hairy, audacious goal. The hard thing is laying people off when you miss the big goal. The hard thing isn't dreaming big. The hard thing is waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat when the dream turns into a nightmare. Sure, you get it. You know that all things require work and that work might be quite difficult. But do you really understand? Do you have any idea just how much work there is going to be? Not work until you get your big break, not work until you make a name for yourself, but work, 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 forever and ever. Is it 10,000 hours or 20,000 hours to mastery? The answer is that it doesn't matter. There is no end zone. To think of a number is to live in a conditional future. We're simply talking about a lot of hours. That to get where we want to go isn't about brilliance, but continual effort. While that's not a terribly sexy idea, it should be an encouraging one, because it means that it's all within reach, for all of us, provided that we have the constitution and the humbleness to be patient and the fortitude to put in the work. By this point, you probably understand why the ego would bristle at this idea. Within reach, it complains, that means you're saying I don't have it now. Exactly right. You don't. No one does. Our ego wants the ideas and the fact that we aspire to do something about them to be enough. Wants the hours we spend planning and attending conferences or chatting with impressed friends to count towards the tally that success seems to require. It wants to be paid well for its time. It wants to do the fun stuff, the stuff that gets attention, credit, or glory. That's the reality. Where we decide to put our energy decides what we'll ultimately accomplish. As a young man, Bill Clinton began a collection of note cards upon which he would write names and phone numbers of friends and acquaintances who might be of service when he eventually entered politics. Each night, before he ever had a reason to, he would flip through the box, make phone calls, write letters, or add notations about their interactions. Over the years, this collection grew to 10,000 cards before it was eventually digitized. It's what put him in the Oval Office and continues to return dividends. Or think of Darwin, working for decades on his theory of evolution, refraining from publishing it because it wasn't yet perfect. Hardly anyone knew what he was working on. No one said, "Hey Charles, it's okay that you're taking so long, because what you're working on is just so important." They didn't know. He couldn't have known. He just knew that it wasn't done yet and that it could be better, and that was enough to keep him going. So, do we sit down alone and struggle with our work? Work that may or may not go anywhere? That may be discouraging or painful? Do we love work? Making a living to do work, not the other way around? Do we love practice the way great athletes do? Or do we chase short-term attention and validation, whether that's indulging in the endless search for ideas or simply the distraction of talk and chatter? Fac si facus. Do it if you're going to do it. There's another apt Latin expression, mat reum superbat opus. The workmanship was better than the material. The material we've been given genetically, emotionally, and financially, that's where we begin. We don't control that. We do control what we make of that material and whether we squander it. As a young basketball player, Bill Bradley would remind himself, when you are not practicing, remember, someone somewhere is practicing, and when you meet him, he will win. The Bible says something similar in its own way. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. You can lie to yourself, saying that you put in the time, or pretend that you're working, but eventually someone will show up. You will be tested, and quite possibly found out. Since Bradley went on to be an All-American, a Rhodes Scholar, and a two-time champion with the New York Knicks and a U.S. Senator, you get the sense that this sort of dedication will take you places. So we must have it, because there is no triumph without toil. Wouldn't it be great if work was as simple as opening a vein and letting the genius pour out? Or if you could walk into that meeting and spit brilliance off the top of your head? You could walk up to the canvas, hurl your paint at it, and modern art emerges, right? That's the fantasy. Rather, that is the lie. Back to another popular old trope. Fake it till you make it. It's no surprise that such an idea has found increasing relevance in our noxiously bullshit nerf world. When it is difficult to tell a real producer from an adept self-promoter, of course, some people will roll the dice and manage to play the confidence game. Make it so you don't have to fake it. That's the key. Can you imagine a doctor trying to get by with anything less? Or a quarterback? Or a bull rider? More to the point, would you want them to? So why would you try it otherwise? Every time you sit down to work, remind yourself, I am delaying gratification by doing this. I am passing the marshmallow test. I am earning what my ambition burns for. I am making an investment in myself instead of in my ego. Give yourself a little credit for this choice, but not so much because you've got to get back to the task at hand. Practicing, working, improving. Work is finding yourself alone at the track when the weather kept everyone else indoors. Work is pushing through the pain in the crappy first drafts and prototypes. It is ignoring whatever plaudits others are getting, and more importantly, ignoring whatever plaudits you may be getting. Because there is work to be done. Work doesn't want to be good. It is made so, despite the headwind. There is another old expression. You know a workman by the chips they leave. It's true. To judge your progress properly, just take a look at the floor. For everything that comes next, ego is the enemy. 'Tis a common proof that lowliness is young ambition's ladder. Shakespeare. We know where we want to end up, success. We want to matter. Wealth and recognition and reputation are nice too. We want it all. The problem is we're not sure that humility can get us there. We are petrified, as the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells put it, that if we are humble, we will end up subjugated, trodden on, embarrassed, and irrelevant. Midway through his career, if you'd asked our model Sherman how he felt, he probably would have described himself in almost exactly those terms. He had not made much money. He had won no great battles. He had not seen his name in lights or headlines. He might have, at that moment, before the Civil War, begun to question the path he'd chosen, and whether those who follow it finished last. This is the kind of thinking that creates the Faustian bargain that turns most clean ambition into shameless addiction. In the early stages, ego can be temporarily adaptive. Craziness can pass for audaciousness. Delusions can pass for confidence. Ignorance for courage. But it's just kicking the cost down the road. Because no one ever said, reflecting on the whole of someone's life, man, that monstrous ego sure was worth it. The internal debate about confidence calls to mind a well-known concept from the radio pioneer Ira Glass, which could be called the taste-talent gap. He said, quote, all of us who do creative work, we get into it because we have good taste. But it's like there's a gap, that for the first couple of years you're making stuff, what you're making isn't so good. It's really not that great. It's trying to be good. It has ambition to be good, but it's not quite that good. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, your taste is still killer, and your taste is good enough that you can tell that what you're making is kind of a disappointment to you. It is in precisely this gap that ego can seem comforting. Who wants to look at themselves and their work and find that it does not measure up? And so here we might bluster our way through, cover up hard truths with sheer force of personality and drive and passion. Or we can face our shortcomings honestly and put the time in. We can let this humble us, see clearly where we are talented and where we need to improve, and then put in the work to bridge that gap. And we can set upon positive habits that will last a lifetime. If ego was tempting in Sherman's time, in this era, we are like Lance Armstrong training for the 1999 Tour de France. We are Barry Bonds debating whether to walk into the Balco Clinic. We flirt with arrogance and deceit, and in the process grossly overstate the importance of winning at all cost. Everyone is juicing, the ego says to us. You should too. There's no way to beat them without it, we think. Of course, what is truly ambitious is to face life and proceed with quiet confidence in spite of the distractions. Let others grasp at crutches. It will be a lonely fight to be real, to say, I'm not going to take the edge off, to say, I'm going to be myself, the best version of that self. I am in this for the long game, no matter how brutal it might be. To do, not be. For Sherman, it was precisely his choice that prepared him for the time his country and history most needed him, and allowed him to navigate the massive responsibilities that shortly came his way. In this quiet crucible, he'd forged a personality that was ambitious but patient, innovative without being brash, brave without being dangerous. He was a real leader. You have a chance to do this yourself, to play a different game, to be utterly audacious in your aims, because what comes next is going to test you in ways that you cannot begin to understand. For ego is a wicked sister of success, and you're about to experience what that means. Part 2. Success. Here we are at the top of the mountain we worked hard to climb, or at least the summit is in sight. We now face new temptations and problems. We breathe thinner air in an unforgiving environment. Why is success so ephemeral? Ego shortens it. Whether a collapse is dramatic or a slow erosion, it's always possible and often unnecessary. We stop learning. We stop listening. We lose our grasp on what matters. We become victims of ourselves in the competition. Sobriety, open-mindedness, organization, and purpose, these are the great stabilizers. They balance out the ego and pride that comes with achievement and recognition. To whatever success you have achieved, ego is the enemy. Two different characters are presented to our emulation. The one of proud ambition and ostentatious avidity. The other of humble modesty and equitable justice. Two different models, two different pictures are held out to us, according to which we may fashion our own character and behavior. The one more gaudy and glittering in its coloring, the other more correct and more exquisitely beautiful in its outline. Adam Smith. At a business meeting in January 1924, Howard Hughes Sr., a successful inventor and tool magnate, stood up, convulsed, and died from a sudden heart attack at the age of 54. His son, a quiet, reserved, and sheltered boy of just 18, inherited 3/4 of the private company, which held patents and leases critical to oil drilling, worth nearly $1 million. Various family members were bequeathed the remaining shares. In a move of almost incomprehensible foresight, the young Hughes, who many saw as a spoiled little boy, made the decision to buy out his relatives and control the entire company himself. Against their objections, and still legally considered a minor, Hughes leveraged his personal assets and nearly all the company's funds to purchase the stock, and in doing so consolidated ownership of a business that would create billions of dollars of cash profit over the next century. It was a bold move for a young man with essentially zero experience in business, and it was with similar boldness that over his career he would create one of the most embarrassing, wasteful, and dishonest business track records in history. In retrospect, his years at the helm of the Hughes empire resemble a deranged crime spree more than a capitalistic enterprise. One cannot argue whether Hughes was gifted, visionary, or brilliant. He just was. Literally a mechanical genius, he was also one of the best and bravest pilots in the pioneer days of aviation. And as a businessman and a filmmaker, he had the ability to predict wide, sweeping changes that came to transform not just the industries he was involved in, but in America itself. Yet after filtering out his acumen from the legend, glamour, and self-promotion at which he was so adept, only one image remains: an egomaniac who evaporated hundreds of millions of dollars of his own wealth and met a miserable, pathetic end. Not by accident, not because he was beset by unforeseen circumstances or competition, but almost exclusively due to his own actions. A quick rundown of his feats, if you can call them that, provides a stark perspective. After purchasing control of his father's tool company from his family, Hughes abandoned it almost immediately, except to repeatedly siphon off its cash. He left Houston and never stepped foot in the company's headquarters again. He moved to Los Angeles, where he decided to become a film producer and celebrity. Trading stocks from his bedside, he lost more than $8 million in the market leading up to the Depression. His most well-known movie, Hell's Angels, took 3 years to make, lost $1.5 million on a budget of $4.2 million, and nearly bankrupted the tool company in the process. Then, not having learned a lesson the first time, Hughes lost another $4 million on Chrysler stock in the early 1930s. He then put all this aside to enter the aviation business, creating a defense contractor called the Hughes Aircraft Company. Despite some astounding personal achievements as an inventor, Hughes's company was a total failure. His 2 contracts during World War II, worth over $40 million, were massive failures at the expense of the American taxpayer and himself. The most notable, the Spruce Goose, which Hughes called the Hercules, and which was one of the biggest planes ever made, took more than 5 years to develop, cost roughly $20 million, and flew just a single time for barely a mile, only 70 feet above the water. At his insistence and expense, it then sat in an air-conditioned hangar in Long Beach for decades at the cost of $1 million a year. Deciding to double down on the film business, Hughes purchased the movie studio RKO and produced losses of over $22 million and went from 2,000 employees to fewer than 500 as he ran it into the ground over the next several years. Tiring of these businesses as he had of the tool company, he forsook defense contracting and handed it off to executives to run, where it slowly began to thrive because of his absence. It would make sense to stop here to avoid belaboring the issue, but that would risk skipping Hughes's egregious tax fraud, the plane crashes and fatal car accidents, the millions he wasted on private investigators, lawyers, contracts for starlets he refused to let act, property he never lived in, the fact that the only thing that ever got him to behave responsibly was the threat of public exposure, the paranoia, racism and bullying, the failed marriages, the drug addiction, and dozens of other ventures and businesses that he mismanaged. That we have made a hero out of Howard Hughes, a young Joan Didion wrote, tells us something interesting about ourselves. She's absolutely right. For Howard Hughes, despite his reputation, was quite possibly one of the worst businessmen of the 20th century. Usually a bad businessman fails and ceases to be in business anymore, making it hard to see what truly caused his failures. But thanks to the steady chain of profits from his father's company, which he found too boring to interfere with, Hughes was able to stay afloat, allowing us to see the damage that his ego repeatedly wrought to himself as a person, to the people around him, to what he wanted to accomplish. There's a scene from Howard's slow descent into madness that bears illustrating. His biographers have him sitting naked in his favorite white chair, unwashed, unkempt, working around the clock to battle lawyers, investigations, investors, in an attempt to save his empire and hide his shameful secrets. One minute he would dictate some irrational, multi-page memo about Kleenex, food preparation, or how employees should not speak to him directly, and then he would turn around and seize upon a genuinely brilliant strategy to outrun his creditors and enemies. It was as if, they observed, his mind and